Hello from Jerusalem and welcome to Beit Avichai. Yom Kippur, which is just a few days away, will begin traditionally with the Kol Nidrei prayer. The discussion of this unique prayer will end our series about the high holiday prayers with Dr. Naomi Cohn Zentner, a researcher of Jewish musical traditions at Ilan University, who will today be discussing the word and melodies of Kol Nidrei with Professor Ruth HaCohen Pinczower, Professor of Musicology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Gmar Chatima Tova.
Welcome to this third of our three-part series on the music of the prayer of the high holidays in Ashkenazi synagogues. Today with me is Professor Ruth HaCohen Pinczower from the Hebrew University, and today we're going to be talking about Kol Nidrei, which we just heard. And I wanted to start by talking about Kol Nidrei as really maybe the most powerful liturgical moment in the high holidays, perhaps even in the entire liturgical year, the prayers of the entire year. And looking to try and understand this very sacred moment in the Jewish life and inside the synagogue in a very special setting. We will try and maybe unravel the secret behind what makes this such an important, poignant moment, and talk about it through understanding its text, its memoirs, historical accounts of this text. And the text itself is really quite an uninspiring, legal, dry text for such an important, significant and religious emotional moment. It's a document which has been seen as very controversial, both by rabbis, by Jewish authorities, and of course by non-Jewish claims that this is a proof that the Jews cannot be trusted, that all of their promises are nullified in synagogue in a public sphere, where they, in this strange language, in a secretive way, absolve themselves of any kind of vows that they took upon themselves during the year. So I wanted to open this question about what it is that makes this moment so important.
So you haven't mentioned, first of all, hello, shalom, Naomi. You haven't mentioned the music itself.
Of course.
But, many people say that it is the music that make it to what it is, which is true. The music is really very, very important, as we shall see in the following, but the text as well. And I think that we have to start with the text. But it's not only the text of the Kol Nidrei. It's the entire, what I see as a kind of a grand overture to Yom Kippur. And it's being constructed as such. So let's see what we have there and how Kol Nidrei, which is the centerpiece of that overture, how it relates to the environment in which it is situated. So first of all, there is the opening of the ark and taking out the Torah scrolls, which makes it into a very important occasion, ma'amad, as we say in Hebrew. And there is that declaration, kind of a powerful speech act, Or zaru al tzaddik u'lishrei lev simcha, which is the light for the righteous, and etc. And immediately after that, we hear that's 3 times, and again 3 times, an opening gesture, very special. In Hebrew, על דעת המקום ועל דעת הקהל, בישיבה של מעלה ובישיבה של מטה, אנו מתירים להתפלל עם העבריינים, with the consent of the Almighty and the consent of this congregation, in a convocation of the heavenly court, convocation of the heavenly court, and a convocation of the lower court, we hereby grant permission to pray with the transgressors. So, first of all, we are saying that we are all kind of righteous, but then there are transgressors. Who are they? Actually, everyone. Everyone is bechezkat, is actually a sort of And now we are constituting our community as community of both righteous and transgressors, which is actually every one of us. And then 3 times comes the Kol Nidrei, 3 times again. Having declared, finished this Kol Nidrei, we are into V'nislach l'chol adat bnei Yisrael. How it is connected to the Kol Nidrei. 3 times. Vayomer Adonai salachti kidvarecha. So you have to take it in its entirety.
It's kind of an arc, something which is being built up and has its symmetry, and it has, in a way, it's kind of a vidui, but our vidui is said in a personal way, and here we do it kval am ve'eda, as we say, in a very congregational setting.
Absolutely. So the congregational setting, the communal setting is very important, and it is what I call a vocal community that is being constituted. And this is important for our discussion today, because we will concentrate on that historical moment, let's say in between mid-19th century up to after World War II, after the Shoah, in which Kol Nidrei in particular became, in Ashkenazi world, I mean European world and also the United States, that very loaded moment. And those vocal communities are being constituted, established through the synagogue. Why is it so important? Because actually before that, I mean before emancipation, before acculturation, Jews were part of, were in a community in which there were all sorts of ways to become Jewish and to become part of the community. After that, a Jew can decide whether to be part of it, of the Jewish community, or not to be. And if he or she wants to be part of the place where to become a Jew was at the synagogue, and through the voice. Even if you are listening just to what's going on, you are actually part of that community of voices. And the person who understood it so well was the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, who wrote in his Star of Redemption the following: "For it is music which takes that first intimate togetherness, in German Zusammengehörigkeit, that is founded in the mutual space and the mutual hearing of the holy word to the conscious and active intimate togetherness of all who are assembled." So this is being done while people are gathering and becoming a tzibur, a kehillah, community, congregation. But then I left the Kol Nidrei. One has to say something about the text of the Kol Nidrei, what it is. First of all, it's in Aramaic, that's important, but also the Kaddish. Kaddish is also important. It's also something that we are saying to ourselves. It's not a prayer. But what do we say? Why is it so emotionally loaded? The way that I understand it, and I follow in a way the psychoanalyst Theodor Reich, without all this baggage, or some psychoanalytic baggage, I would like to suggest that this is a kind of a performative speech act. Actually a disclaimer. Disclaimer of what? That with all our good intentions, repentance, and promises to ourselves that we will be better, we know that we will fail.
Inevitably, as
Inevitably.
being human, of course.
Exactly. Being human means that sometimes just life occurs and we are drifted, and all of a sudden we are become aware that it's not what we wanted from ourselves to do. So facing that, because we had it last year and the year before, and want to be there in the next year, and so on. It's not the repenting, echta ve'ashuv, I will sin and then repent. No, it is done in good faith. But nevertheless, it's a very tense and poignant moment, as you said, in which everything is somehow hanging on whether we will be able to carry it through with all our knowledge of our being kind of fickle, frail, and our very humanness. On that, you can build all the other things related to that moment.
So moving on from this disclaimer to try and understand how, this is how maybe we or you feel about this, and Theodor Reich, if we go and try and understand more about the experience or the perception of the experience of Kol Nidrei among other people, we have all different accounts which we can learn from, poetic, historic, literary, to try and understand how others try to understand and experience this moment of Kol Nidrei in the synagogue.
Yes, I just want to bring for that, Naomi, two moments which I think are very telling, revelatory about that experience. And this is a poem, first, by the Israeli Jewish poetess Zelda Schneerson. She's coming from the important Chabad family. She was a cousin of the last Chabad rabbi. I would like to read her poem. I translated it from Hebrew to English, and that's how it is. On Yom Kippur Eve, we sailed from trials that ended to trials that started. Yom Kippur Eve was the beginning of time for us, in the silence of islands that lit ocean with candles, where you embraced me to your aching heart before the Almighty, afore you would go to pray with them all, afore you'd come one of the congregation in the shrine, one of the tree in the forest. So this is a very sensitive poem written after the Shoah. It's very, very clear. First part is indeed the sailing, our life, which is kind of a journey, a very shaky one. And there is a Yom Kippur as an island, silence of an island, in that ocean, and the candles, which are always part of Yom Kippur. And that's the moment before they go to the synagogue. She and her beloved one, they are standing there, and he is with his aching heart. Yes, in between, after the First War, in between the wars, Shoah, and after that, the community, those vocal communities became also communities of pain. Mm-hmm. And then he's going. Before you would pray with them all. I mean, that's the individual within that congregation.
The tree within the forest.
Exactly. So he is a tree. It's not either the forest or the trees. It's both of them. So that's about Zelda. The Jerusalemite, which I knew personally. Yes. And here is we'll go from here to Shai Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon. And that's a very special memoir of Agnon. He writes also after the Shoah, and it's important to note that. And in it, he describes his experience as a 4-year-old toddler boy that for the first time became aware of that moment. And that's what he tells us. The sky was pure, the earth was still, and all the streets were clean. And a new breeze was fluttering around. He was lad of 4, dressed in holiday clothes, and a relative took me to my father and my grandfather. The grandfathers are always important. In the house of prayer. The house of prayer was full of talith-cladded people, silver cornets on their heads, dressed all in white, with prayer books in their hands. Numerous candles were stuck in long boxes of sand, emitting a gorgeous light with a lovely scent. So it's a sort of an all sensual experience, kind of synesthesia in action. An old man stands inclined before the Omed, and his talith descends beneath his heart, and pleasant, sweet voices emanating from behind the garment. And I stand at the window of the house of prayer, trembling and amazed at the pleasant voices and the silver cornets and the gorgeous lights and the scent of honey coming from the candles. I didn't know then to reflect on abstract ideas, nor was I familiar with the concept of holiness. But I have no doubt that I felt at the time the holiness of the place and the holiness of the day and the holiness of the people who stand in the house of God in prayer and niguns. House of God, it doesn't say synagogue, Beit Tefillah, it says. And I have not distinguished between one man and the other. Forest, as all, together with the entire house, appeared to me as one unit. Hayu alai k'chativa achat. A great joy suffused my heart, and my heart was bonded with love for this house and these men and these niguns. Gradually the nigun ceased in a soft, heavenly moaning, but Kol Menahemet lingered for a moment until it ceased as well. So this is, after all, although all the senses are important, but the vocal element, the sonic element, is that which makes it what it is what makes these people into chativa achat, into one unit. And it describes very, very sensitively that sort of moaning, of murmuring, which is part of the sonic experience, the soundscape of the synagogue.
Yeah, so we can maybe even start to envision what it is that he's hearing when he speaks about this moaning. It's kind of sort of a background noise with, we know that we often speak about this in musicology as kind of a modal cloud, a cloud of sound, whereas you have the cantor and there's a murmur, which is kind of a supporting murmur, and sometimes even an actual melodic response where the congregation joins in voice, as we say, something which forms the community itself, the fact that they can sing together, the fact that they have this musical experience together, and supporting the cantor and also being kind of a backdrop to highlight what it is that he's doing.
Exactly, and that experience, which sometimes Jews were accused as being noisy because of that, is what makes it into what it is. And in order to understand that sonic element, to which we will move now, of the Kol Nidrei, it is, of course, led by the Baal Tefillah, the cantor, the Shliach Tzibur, but it is a kind of a joint enterprise of both congregation and the cantor, and they have to listen to one another. And he cannot come with the same thing that he did a year before. He has to be very attuned to the moment.
So in a way, we speak of the music and the melody maybe of Kol Nidrei, but we have to ask ourselves, is this even maybe a melody? Can it be considered a tune, or perhaps it's something which is more a collection of different motifs which are bound together as a sound? We spoke in a previous session with Professor Eliyahu Schleifer about Nigunim Sinai, and we mentioned that the most famous one is Kol Nidrei, and these are considered very ancient melodies, something which has been in the Jewish Ashkenazi tradition for centuries and perhaps for a very, very long time, and it really has gained kind of an iconic stature, the actual melody itself, if we decide to choose to call it a melody. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we define this music, what we hear, and as you say, this dialogue between the cantor and the community, which gives these responses which add to the whole sense of performative.
Yeah, it is indeed that sort of Nigun Sinai, as you mentioned it in your discussion with Professor Schleifer. And I would like to say that those moments are sort of monuments, kind of moving monuments. That is to say, there is a structure in it. It's not just the nusach that you can run with, for kind of long swath of the prayer. It has that structure, and it compels the cantor to do certain things. Within it, there are stages, there are degrees of freedom in which he can undertake, and which creates it into something which is moving in both sense of the word. I mean, something that really
Progresses.
And something which is really touches us as well. So what are those elements? There is, first of all, in the nigun itself, in the melodic structure of it, that element of the very huge ambitus that he is going through. There is this melancholic beginning and triumphal ending. And there are those phrases which he can somehow play with, but once he went into certain direction, then he has to abide by his own choices. So, for example, or the first thing is that the very first phrase is something that everybody does. You cannot skip it. You cannot do something else. It is this. It's that melancholic beginning. So what is it? It is a kind of a concave arch, which then is climbing up. But it's not just that contour, it's also through those sighs, those chromatic sighs, sospiri, we call it in the world of opera. So you have it, if we see here the examples, there are kind of different versions of it that Arnold Schoenberg, the Jewish composer, made when he composed for composing his Kol Nidrei. So you have it like the Kornitzer type, and then you get into some certain point and you continue it. And if you look at the second stuff, you see that the other one, the shore, is much more embellished. That's where freedom enters. You can be more vocalized, more kind of vocalizer and melismas, as we call it. But everyone, if you look at it, go back to this, is doing something very similar. Those who have more notes, it means that they put text in it, and we'll hear it just in a moment.
So there's the option to add text to this first very definitive motif, which without this we don't have Kol Nidrei, this da-da-na-na-na-na. You can add text to it, or you can sing it as is, as a melisma, as a nigun.
Yes, and there's also elements in between, but you have to open with it.
Yeah.
What you do afterwards,
there's more of a degree of freedom, you see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's listen to two cantors. The first, we heard him in the very beginning, is the cantor Zvulun Kvartin, and you hear him with the organ, and you see how he is solving this kind of problem or possibility, and then we'll listen to Joseph Basser. This is a recording from 1906, that old, and from a synagogue in Vienna.
Yes, which I actually have heard of a lot, because this was the synagogue my grandfather used to pray, and he was a part of the choir.
That's amazing.
Up until 1938, when he had to escape Vienna, but he was very much involved. I mean, this choir is a long time before he was even born, but you can just imagine this was the kind of sound that existed in the synagogue, so it's very special for me to be able to hear this example.
And this is being recorded not in action, but just as more or less as it was. So let's listen first to Kvarti.
Der
declares the Kol Nidrei.
At the end, as a cadence.
Exactly. Kol is a very, very long melisma, and then the Kol Nidrei again in the very last notes. So that's a choice, and a beautiful one, because it is a sort of, here I am declaring what it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we are going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now we'll listen to Basser. We'll see what he's doing. So, example number 2. That's how he made it. He actually said the entire first sentence, which is all those different sort of swears, promises, vows, etc. So all the words that we have in Aramaic for what people are undertaking on themselves. So he finished it, he said them all, and then the congregation enters, the choir enters toward the very end, concluded it as such.
Yeah, so it's interesting because in a way, once you have a choir, it sort of maybe would confine a cantor as to how much freedom they have. But here, the fact that he is choirless, that he's really a cappella himself, solo, all the way till the very end really allows him this degree of freedom that we're speaking about, of the ability to improvise, to add on a little melisma, to maybe take a little more time. And he's not confined by something which the choir would need to know ahead of time.
Exactly. So I think this is really important, this kind of improvisation, extemporation that one is doing according to his feeling and the feeling of the congregation, or her feeling in case of when a woman is leading the service. Mm-hmm. Yes, so how do we continue from here? And so the next, just to remind us, the next phrase is, go back to the text. We finished the first one, and we have for Basser, Din darna, v'di shtabana, v'di chachamina, v'di asarna nafshatana. מיום כיפורים שעבר, עד יום כיפורים הזה, שבא עלינו, יום כיפורים הזה, עד יום הכיפורים הבא עלינו לטובה. And in English, all those different prohibitions, consecration, oath, and etc. And that we may vow or swear or consecrate from the previous day of atonement until the day of atonement, and from this day of atonement. By the way, there is a kind of a controversy whether this was said and how it was said, but that became a kind of a standard. Mm-hmm. And it relates to this kind of disclaimer I was talking about. What we did from there, for them to now, and what we will do from here onward. Mm-hmm. Yes. So, just to remind us, Kvartim, he has to say first all those names. I mean, the Esarei, Shvuei.
Yes, which he hasn't done in the previous motif, which we're calling motif A.
Yes.
Which while we see that Basel, within this same motif A, managed to get in all of this text.
Exactly.
So they have different way. Now they have the second motif, but each one has to put a different section of text into it.
Yes, exactly. Just in order to prepare ourselves, there is this very famous motif as well. Which Kvartim will choose. Our Basser will do something else. Mm-hmm. We call it B, this we call C. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that Basser never used, in the entire Kol Nidrei, never use motif B, which is really very important for many other cantors.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. It's almost as though there are these building blocks which Kol Nidrei is made of, and you can sort of move them around, maybe except for the first introductory A part. But the B and C can be changed around, or you can even never get to a B and just go straight to the C. There's a certain degree of freedom. Again, each cantor chooses or comes with a tradition that he is part of. But when we look at Kol Nidrei, it's not a clear A, B, C, D melody.
Yes, but there is a logic to the connections. What it can be connected to what, and that every sort of phrase should be ended somehow. And many of them are ending in this kind of triumphal ending. The last one should be the most triumphal. And so you can do certain things and other things you cannot do. So for example, when we listen to other examples, you can, there is this shvikin shvitin which comes later on. You can do, in most of the ballet tefillah, the cantors are doing or something of this. So also one can extemporize on that, do something more elaborate on it. But that's, a shvikin shvitin is very, very important, which means that all of them will be resolved. So that's why it becomes a kind of a moment within the moment. Okay, so now let's listen to first Varti, and we'll see what he is doing in the second and third phrase. Number 3. That's D. Here's the din dama. Si.
It's just so fascinating how this melody, if we choose to call it as such, this Kol Nidrei melody, is sort of taking us on a roller coaster of emotions, from like trepidation in the beginning to this triumph, and it always has to end with a triumph, and often it is even the response of the congregation or the choir, da 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 da, or betelim uvutalin. We come to a sort of da 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 da. So very sort of triumphant and full of faith and bitachon, and so it's sort of, and then we go back again. We do this 3 times, every time with a growing crescendo in tempo and feeling and emotion. We keep being brought from fear, from yirah maybe, from trepidation, to triumph again and again and again within the text and in the repetitions of the entire text. It's just fascinating.
It is indeed, and since you mentioned this motif, this is, and I refer here to my colleague and friend Boaz Tarsi, worked on these cross-repertory motifs that we find, for example, in the end of Avot, in the Chazarat Hashatz, in the different
Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avoteinu.
So that's something that is familiar. So there are moments like that also within it. It's interesting what we just heard, that also the din dana that we have vowed, almost everyone is doing with this, with a din dana, and it's so, it was really beautiful. It started with the major key, and then he moved from it into something which is more in the kind of the minor streak in it, is a kind of a sort of painful poignant element that comes back into it. That's what you said, this kind of a roller coaster. Everything is included in it. Okay, so what about Basser? What he will give us for the continuation? So he has to start with a din darna, and he will start with it. So we listen now to the continuation of Basser's version of Kol Nidrei. So you see, they are singing together. Only him. Minor, again. The D was. It's like the din darna. Ronny und Sharon. Shvitin.
It's interesting to think at the places where today certain choral responses, something which would be done by the choir, today is done, at least in Israel, many communities, by the congregation, and they really realize that they have a role in this performance. They have a role also to give maybe the cantor the time to breathe, but also to join in with him and give him kind of a support, and they know where he's going, of course, because often in these synagogues the same cantor has been doing Kol Nidrei every year, and so they know to anticipate where it is he's going to go musically and which motifs he's going to use and how they're supposed to be able to join in.
But that has, of course, a problem, because then there is no place for something to be done
differently.
Yes, which is reacting to the moment and to the emotions that comes with it. It becomes a routine.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the first enemy for a good prayer, for a good service, that it becomes kind of everything is already expected, and we know everything how it's going to be. Yeah.
When our prayer becomes regular, we lose this supplication or this begging that we have.
Yeah, and those cantors of the golden age, they knew how to do it, so that it becomes indeed new. I remember myself in the synagogue that my parents went when I was a girl. It was, although they worked from Germany, but there was a Eastern European synagogue, and the kind of Baal Tefillah that we had there, he did every time something else, and it was, on the one hand, you could expect, but how exactly he will perform it? What sort of vocalise he will make, like the one with which Basser ended his that part? That's something which relates to his musicality, to his feeling, to his sense of the moment, and Kol Nidrei allows for that.
Mm-hmm. Meaning the fact that it's done this is a different year, this is a new year, different things are demanded of us, and we have this freedom to express musically this change that we have in ourselves or in the community or in history or in whatever's happening in the world.
And the cantor as such is the leader of all that which takes place.
Mm-hmm.
And from that point of view, I think it's interesting to see a certain solution to Kol Nidrei that the Reform Synagogue in Berlin undertook in times in which it started to become very risky. I mean, before the Nazis came to power, but already all those winds were blowing. And what they did is trying to guard themselves against those anti-Semitic accusations.
That
yes,
this text itself is really not at all
they
acceptable.
First of all, most of the prayer was in German. That was part of the Reform movement. And here you have a very rare recording that was found sometimes in the 80s, 90s in Australia of that synagogue. And they are doing it in German, as I said, and the text is not Kol Nidrei, it's aus der Tiefe, out of the depths, Me'amakim, Terati Chaya, Psalm 130, and that's what they sang. And they take the version of Lewandowski, who was part of that community 2 generations before, or 1 generation before, and the kind of the way that they fit the German words within that compositional whole is very telling, it's very interesting. And the choir is participating in a beautiful way. So here it is, and we can listen to it while we see the text. There is here a translation to English as well. And you will hear, for example, that the very first phrase is the cantor, and it is about supplication out of the depth, aus der Tiefe, rufe ich dich, O ewiger, O Lord Hashem. And it's all about that. So it's interesting that the text itself, the music can undertake this text because it's indeed about that.
Mm-hmm.
And what is very special to this rendition of the tune, Nigun, is that the first phrase ends again, it starts to develop and then goes back to the first phrase, to the tiri tiri tiara, and so on. And that, in that way, concludes the whole section.
Mm-hmm.
And then the choir enters with, for with you there is forgiveness, ki imcha slicha leman tivare, which is already a sort of optimistic acknowledgement.
Mm-hmm.
And he will answer to them in the same vein. And you will see that the text is sensitive to the melody and the melody to the text in a way.
So it's really interesting how this was, on one hand, just a strategy of sort of doing away with the problematic text while keeping the melody, which everyone feels so connected to. And how could you have a Yom Kippur without this melody? Even if you take the text away, we replace the text with a psalm, Mimamakim, but it turns out to be so perfectly fitting. I mean, it's not done by itself. Someone has to make the effort of deciding which phrase should be sung to what, but it's done in a really such a beautiful way.
And of course, this psalm is very much related, as we know, that during Aseret Yemei Tshuva, that's the psalm that is being recited just before Shacharit, the major Birkot Shachar. So it's part of the liturgy of the days. And it also speaks to the German non-Jewish audience, which is important, one should know. So in this particular performance, what we have is the Hermann Schei, who was a baritone and was a Jewish singer in the opera, which survived the war in Holland, hidden somewhere. And the choir, and the choir itself, when we hear them, most of the Jews in Berlin did not survive. So we hear these voices. And this is a kind of a very touching moment, I feel. So we'll hear that, number 6.
Very beautiful, so emotional.
Yes. You heard that Hare Israel, that which is hope Israel. It's the Shvikin Shvitim. I mean, that's kind of release. It's also you can really hope for God. So these two sentences are in a way equal or parallel to one another, and the music enables it to be heard as such.
To hear this parallel, the music is giving us this key to this code.
Yeah.
So before we conclude, we do want to go to another pre-Holocaust sort of depiction of Kol Nidrei, and this time within the realm of film.
Yes, the prodigal son, it is. I mean, the son comes back after he was attracted to the glory of the opera, to the allure of opera. That Baal Tefillah, that cantor, that was the pride of the community in Vilnius, and he somehow betrayed them, at least according to their way that they perceived it. And this kind of tension between the opera and the synagogue was something very strong from the middle of the 19th century all through the next 100 years. And there are many cantors that were both ways, and the actor himself, Moshe Oisha, was a person who had a similar career. So how you are actually juggling between these worlds. And this one, yeah.
So this film from 1940,
Yes.
which was called Der Wilner Stadthasen, the Vilna town cantor, is sort of telling the story, which is coincidentally also related to the biography of the cantor himself, who we see here as an actor, torn between these two worlds. And Kol Nidrei is kind of a heightened moment in his personal life, and of course, as we know, in the prayer, as a moment of homecoming, or perhaps not, is drawn towards something.
Yes, and a sort of repentance, if you want, and deciding to be part of that community back, that's his home. And that's a very potent moment, dramatically, musically, whatever you want. He comes back. That's the end of the movie itself. They don't know that he's there. There was a kind of a big crisis just beforehand, and he is there in order to bring his voice for the last time in Kol Nidrei.
So what we see now is the cantor. You'll tell us exactly which cantor we're seeing in what section?
Yes, so in the beginning, this is a community after he left, and it's a kind of a dull community that it's the force that actually led it through these days is missing. So he's going through the motions, I mean, the person who is doing it. And what you will hear actually is the version of Rusotto that was something that became very prevalent in the United States, as everybody could recognize it. And they're doing it in a kind of, as we call it in a Jewish way, mitzvat anashim melumada, I mean, the regular way. And you feel that they are all kind of, sort of, not depressed by something.
Something's missing.
Yes.
They're going through the motions, but there's no emotion.
Exactly. Motions, but not emotions. And then we see him. We see him just entered. The camera is concentrating on his face in a kind of a close-up, and he approaches, and when they reach the din darna, and we are already now sensitive to the din darna moment, the other cantor is doing din darna in a kind of a way that people are doing it, and then you hear this voice, din darna, and everyone is kind of dumbfounded to hear that voice that they so missed. And he comes forward and he takes a talit on himself. And in the way, you're recognizing the kind of ways how the gesture is being done. And everybody is so overwhelmed by that, and so, in a way, delighted and enlightened. And he is doing it his way. And his way is just somehow deviating from that regular formal way until that moment in which he will not continue. And also just pay attention to that sentence, the Yom Kippurim ze ad Yom Kippurim haba. You will see that he's doing it his own way. I think this is the most kind of up to you phrase that you can do whatever you want. So there are some who just are just murmuring it. Also, Basser did something interesting, and he will make something from it, and it's not just by coincidence. So we'll hear that, and until that moment in which he collapses.
Mm-hmm. So dramatic, and then it faints within this.
It faints, and then they say, "For you, the goyim, for you, he just sang. For us, he davened." And that, for them, makes it into a kind of reconciliation with all that sort of biographical history.
So he belongs to us in the end. His heart was in the synagogue.
Exactly. And so, but it could be differently. I mean, sometimes people didn't end up in the synagogue.
Yeah.
And in the jazz singer, which this movie I see is a kind of rejoinder to the jazz singer. He goes to the synagogue and he will do the Kol Nidrei, but then he will go back to his former life. I mean, so there are all sorts of ways, and the decision where to belong is part of what Kol Nidrei is about.
We're coming to the end of our session, and if we see Kol Nidrei as kind of a peak in the beginning of the Yom Kippur prayers, I think that coming towards the end, we see another ascension to another peak for Ne'ilah.
Sure.
And there I think that it's almost, we have like a two-peaked mountain of the Yom Kippur prayers, where we're coming into with Kol Nidrei, this very heightened spiritual moment. And then we also end with a similar 7-time repetition and 3-time repetition, Hashem Hu Elohim, etc. And we come to this sort of summit. And I wanted to sort of end on maybe a personal note to ask you, for you, which psukim throughout the Yom Kippur prayer are most personal, speak to you most, or seem most relevant to you today?
So it is very interesting that those moments are not really, they of course being sung in a nusach, but they don't have a special melody. And these are the words that the philosopher Naomi Cohn, the teacher of Rosenzweig with whom we started, in his chapter on Yom Kippur, which is a beautiful chapter in his religion of the, in his chapter on Yom Kippur, he isolates these sentences from the Ne'ilah, which are really unique. And they're just there. I mean, we are saying them in the, first of all, the Tefillah B'Lachash to ourselves personally, and then the Chazarat HaShatz. And that's what is being said. אתה נותן יד לפושעים, וימינך פרוסה לקבל שווים. ותלמדנו להתוודות לפניך על כל עוונותינו למען נחדל מעושק ידינו. To confess before you all our iniquities, so that we may refrain from the injustice of our hands. And in this year in Israel, when we are having such a crisis in our society, the iniquities that we have to refrain from, that's the major thing for Yom Kippur is about. And later on, a paragraph later, we are saying, you have set man apart from the beginning and recognize him as worthy to stand before you. It's for Enosh. It's not the Jew. It's every human being. It's about every human being. Although usually people say the Yom Kippur is for the Jews. No, it reminds us that we are in a universal community. For who could tell you what you should do? That's taken from Job, from the book of Job. And even if he be righteous, what does he give you? So that's also the kind of existential standing of a humans before God, and knowing that there's kind of endless distance between himself, herself, and God, and the idea of ימינך פשוטה לקבל שווים, but למען נחדל מעושק ידינו. That's for me the essence of Yom Kippur.
Thank you. So thank you very, very much for this fascinating
Thank you, Naomi.
talk
It was
about
my
Kol Nidrei. It was wonderful. And I wish you a Shana Tova and a Gmar Chatima Tova.
And for you too and your family.
Thank you very much.
And for all those who are part of the human family.
Amen.